desinfectar. La causa de desinfectar. Quan li passes el... Ja? Sí. Bona tarda. Se sent?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me? Thank you for being here. Thank you for carrying out, for being here physically in a roundtable discussion like this one. To talk on behalf of women in conflict and ISIP, I'd like to welcome you. As you know, this is a panel to give voice to women, surviving women, fighting women, entrepreneurial women, courageous women, women who are engaged, women who are ready to build up communication bridges in order to make headway as a society. And that's why we're here, in order to start this road. The Catalonian Institute for Peace, and those of you who have actually had the guided tour, you have seen the performance and visual arts. We believe in culture as a tool for social transformation. And that's why we have brought here this project called Is There Anybody Still in the Forest? After 3 years of hard work, in this case in Bosnia, I'd like to greet very warmly Melissa Dobrobam and Ajna, two of the very courageous and struggling women we have found for this project, and to whom we have tried to give her a voice. Is There Still Somebody in the Forest is a triple art project with photography, a TV documentary, and a play that will be in the Catalonian National Theatre starting on the 14th of January. Somehow, this triple project wants to give a voice to the women who survived the horror of the Bosnia and Herzegovina war. And 25 years later, they are still here, not only to demand justice, but also to make sure that this does not happen again in so many other places in the world. Well, they are the ones who should be talking today. So without any further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Xavier Masdurens, the president of the Catalonian Institute for Peace. Thank you, Fraser. On behalf of the whole ISIP team, I'd like to welcome you. To us, it's such a pleasure to be able to carry out a hybrid event with physical presence and with streaming. Thank you for being here, and thank you to all of the people who are attending via streaming. The only thing I want to do is that once again, we present an event about resistance and resilience experiences. What about? Well, in the face of armed conflicts, and those peace workers say that a lot of people work to actually just cover the conflict, not solve it. Today we will listen to some very hard experiences, but experiences of resilience for conflict. And I'm going to introduce the 4 people who will be talking here today and the moderator. And I'm doing it in Spanish so that people can translate it well into Bosnian. First of all, we will listen to them through the screen. Ajna Jusić who is the founder and president of the Forgotten Children from the War. She is the protagonist of the documentary film that the Catalonian TV station will broadcast, and that can also be seen in the filming platform. She is the outcome of a rape during the war, and now precisely she is the chairwoman of the organization against the stigma that implies the victimization of the raped women and their children. Secondly, Nour Merdžić, who will also be on screen, she's a founding member of the Assistance to Women Victims of War, headquartered in Sarajevo. She actually witnessed the massive rapes during the war. And now we see not only in her country, but throughout the world, those who have been silenced, especially in Bosnia. Thirdly, Helga Flamtermesky, who is Colombian. She has been living in Barcelona for 21 years. She is a PhD in social psychology and she's a feminist. And currently she coordinates the Diaspora Women NGO. She specializes in the psychological processes of migrants. And finally, the last experience will be by Nour Salameh. She is a Syrian self-exiled. She's a PhD in contemporary history, and she's a researcher at the UNESCO Chair for Intercultural Dialogue in the Mediterranean at the Rovira and Virgilia University. She's an activist and a defender of human rights. And Pamela Urrutia, she is a researcher at the School of Culture for Peace at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Her main work field is the analysis of armed conflicts, the socio-political crisis and peace processes in Northern Africa, the Middle East, etc. She's also interested in gender analysis in conflicts and the gender, peace, and conflicts agenda. So I'm going to give them the floor now. I don't know if you can hear me well. Can you hear me well? Yes? You can't hear me well. I think your mic is not on. Now it's on. Yes. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the ICIP for organizing this event and for inviting us. It's an event that will allow us to listen to the women I have the privilege to introduce here today. This is a space for thinking and for active listening that doesn't need to be justified. It doesn't need any justification. But it is true that it has a greater influence and a greater relevance at a time in which we're holding the 25th anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, as Xavier has just told us, an agenda that was started up due to the Article 1325 of the United Nations back in 2000, and it has actually highlighted the need to consider the differentiated impacts of armed conflicts from a gender perspective, and also the key role and necessary role played by women in all of the efforts to transform conflicts and to build up peace. Bearing in mind the pandemic and bearing in mind what we have just heard, if you'll allow me, I'm going to start out with a personal note. When Maria Savanlo from ICIP invited me to introduce this event, I was a bit moved by the news coming from Chile about a clandestine arrest center. The members of the dictatorship called it Meda 6, based on the sexual abuse and torture that was done in that center. A few weeks ago, there was a court ruling that said that this rape was a form of physical violence against women. And the survivors of this violence, what they underlie is that it was sexual violence, but it was also political violence. They were raped and they were arrested and raped to actually punish them for being against the dictatorship. So one of the first things I did when I heard these news is it's impossible for me not to intertwine and to link up this experience with all of the other cases we shall be talking about here today, both in Bosnia, Syria, and Colombia. It is the common denominator of the three cases, and it actually crosses us as an open wound. It's a violence that has affected different communities, and it crosses generations, as we have just been reminded. And it happens both in times of war and in times of peace. It is part of this continuum of violence that affects women. It becomes heightened during war times, and it affects mainly women. Sexual violence, specifically rape, it is a war practice that has as an end to destroy the integrity and the dignity of women. And it also looks for framing them and through them to send a message of terror and domination to ease the control of populations at large. In spite of all of the cases that have been documented historically, it is a phenomenon that for some time it has not been visible. It has been silenced. And it was not until the 90s of last century that they started being heard of internationally, due to what happened in Rwanda and due to the Balkans War, specifically with regards to Bosnia, where the use of sexual violence was documented as a war weapon and as a crucial part of the war strategy carried out. Recently in Syria, Syria has also been a case in which the sexual violence has become more relevant. It has received more media attention, maybe because of the role played by the news about the sex slave centers created by ISIS or in Iraq. And genocide has been raised as a category in the fight against ethnic groups. And it is leaving an open wound for children who are the result of these systematic rapes. But to be honest, it is less visible, but it is also an integral part of Bashar al-Assad's regime. I'm not going to get into that because, well, I'm sure our guest will refer to this, but it is a mechanism of censorship and repression. Sexual violence has been underreported, and it brings people to a situation of taking refuge as a result of the fear against that sexual violence. And it is a sexual violence that has been experienced by women during decades of armed violences. And women have always been considered a territory to be conquered as loot and as a goal, as a target to actually win over the enemy. Melissa will talk about this and about other consequences of armed conflicts. But there are consequences that it's impossible to dissociate from patriarchal structures and the gender inequality that is an inherent part of this conflict. And it is part of the experience of men and women in situations of armed conflict. I mean, men and women have very different experiences of wartime. The role played by patriarchy and the economic structures play a significant role, and they exacerbate gender inequalities. And here I'd like to make a point. According to the data we have at the School of Peace, most of armed conflicts, about 83%, occur in contexts in which there are medium to high or very high inequality levels. That's an important piece of data to bear in mind. But here today, we're talking about resistance and resilience initiatives, and as a way of claiming the significant role played by women in the construction of peace. Globally, I have to say, there is the exclusion of women from the formal spaces of negotiation, in spite of the commitments of the framework of the article on peace and security. But Colombia somehow is an exceptional case where they have reached as more substantial and proactive participation of women, both during the process and the peace agreements. And in spite of all the difficulties that exist nowadays, at the moment this agreement was signed, it is still a point of reference with many processes that try to identify useful mechanisms. Beyond this space, this high-level space, I need to insist that women are mobilizing against war and rape, and they have demanded the transformation of the inclusion of gender as a part of the transformation towards a peaceful society, and in a very significant and proactive way. They want to be involved in anything that's related to the reconstruction of memory, the struggle against impunity, and the documentation against abuses, and the search for truths that are oftentimes intolerable. And the group Women from Colombia have done an excellent work, and I don't know whether Helga will talk about it, but they are a point of reference with regards to having a memory from a feminist perspective based on women. And in the last few years, some of these initiatives have been recognized. Let's remember the prize to the courage of women from Croatia when they tried to clear up what had happened to their children, the so-called false positives, and also the reunion with their families. And this links up with the experience in Latin America, in Argentina and Chile, and also more recent initiatives, like, for example, in Syria, with groups like Families for Freedom. The exchange of experiences are a crucial part of this process of feminist women looking for experiences where they can feel themselves being reflected and where they can share histories, give a new meaning to their pain and suffering, and also to analyze significantly the role played by sexual violence. And finally, sometimes I have the feeling that when we talk about resistance and resilience, there is the risk of losing sight of the fact that this has to be closely related to the search for the truth and justice and mechanisms of repair to make sure that there is justice for this type of abuse. And going back to what I mentioned at the beginning, the experience of these survivors from Chile, justice has to come timely, not 50 years later. So this is a good space to think about the mechanisms that have been started up in Bosnia, Syria, Colombia, which are offering guarantees to access the truth, justice, and to make sure that that there should be days to repair, as today's photography exhibition shows, and also the TV documentary. Experiences for repair. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to start with the first round of questions. The first round will be devoted to thinking about which have been the main effects suffered by women in different conflicts, and how they have experienced conflicts differently. If you'll agree, we'll start with our Bosnian colleagues. Yes, let's start with them. Melissa, who is on screen, maybe you could be the one to share with us your thoughts about this topic.
Dobro večer.
Good afternoon.
Con nosotros mientras se resuelven los problemas técnicos. No sé si
Whilst technical problems are being solved, I don't know whether Helga or Noor would like to start sharing the thoughts with us.
Dobro večer. Ania, ¿puedes entrar? ¿Nos escuchas?
Ajna, can you hear us? Yes, I can hear you, but could you please repeat the question because I can't remember it? I can hear you well, but I can't remember the question. Well, Melissa says that she can hear us well, but she cannot make herself heard.
María, damos paso a Ania entonces.
Okay, Maria.
Ania, por favor.
Hoću počet ću samo zamolila bi da mi ponovite pitanje, molim vas.
Okay, well, may I start? But please do repeat the question again for me. Okay, what are the main effects experienced by women in each one of the conflicts? And what are the different impact that women get and that men do not get? I mean, what's the distinction between the impact for women specifically in war situations? Well, to start, good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you're all well and healthy. Thank you for inviting me. Now, with regards to the Bosnia and Herzegovina war and the suffering of women, we have to talk about the Bosnian war. The war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it implied between 25,000 and 50,000 rapes, sexual violence. And women in Bosnia and Herzegovina have suffered the worst violations of human rights and dignity. And as my mother would say, my mother used to say that if we are to survive, we are here to we have survived from all of the things we experienced, but what has been worse for her is to be able to survive the post-war situation. We still live in a very highly patriarchal society, a society in which things are silenced, and the committee talks about 5 cases of rape in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and according to the War Crime Court at The Hague, that's what it has been brought there. The participation of women during the war has never been recognized enough, both as participants and caretakers in families and as nurses. But what happened after the war, I mean, what each one of them has suffered, the social system has just left it completely on the side. It has completely ignored it. And in addition to having suffered sexual and physical violence, rapes, the system forgot to say that these very same women had children. My mother, at the age of 21, was raped, and I was born after the rapes. But I've never understood how my mother felt and why I as the daughter of a woman who has suffered so much, have never received any help or any care. There are some categories of women who have participated in the war. Women, military women, or those who got medals, and their children, they do have advantages. But, I mean, military men do have medals and advantages, but women do not get any advantages. These women were not recognized until 2006 as victims, and after 2006 they got some rights. But what has happened in this case is the fact that women who have suffered this physical and sexual violence, they have had less rights than the women who live in other parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina and who have not been protected. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, more than 9,000 women died. But if you look at the monuments that have been raised, the monuments have been erected to people who were in the war. There are very few female names. And that's due to the patriarchal pressure that does not allow, and it does not want to allow, any type of gender equality between men and women. War has never ever respected women, and what happened in Bosnia-Herzegovina is that war was carried out through women, through the bodies of women. And this is something that we need to combat nowadays. And we need to struggle against this society that has such high tolerance towards violence against women, that have been suffered not only by soldiers, but also more than 10,000 women have suffered in this war, and they had to go through much worse situations than many soldiers. Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody. Warm greetings to all of the attendants for following us through streaming. It's for me, it's such a pleasure to participate in this panel discussion. I need to get to know all of the people present, women who work, women who have been victims of violence during wartime, and women who have given support to women in Bosnia-Herzegovina since 1995. We have created an association in which there are women from all nationalities and ethnic groups, Serbian, Bosnian, Croatians, Gypsies, all of the women who have suffered physical violence during the war and rape. These women have prepared a project that they presented to the Bosnia-Herzegovina government in order to persecute the war criminals who have committed these horrendous crimes. The figures tell us that there have been more than 25,000, between 25,000 and 50,000 women who were raped. We have more than 9,400 members from different ethnic groups and from different religions who are victims, who are war victims. A lot of them belong to 73 different municipalities. There are also men, a few thousand men, who, however, have stopped silencing the facts, who have stopped speaking up, and who have come along with these women. Some of the women who had children out of the rapes, some of them have kept the children and others have given them on adoption. Women aged from the age of 7 to 70 have been shot off. They have been shot off in concentration centers and houses where they were systematically raped, they were systematically tortured, and They were present during the massive killings, during the massive murders. All of these women, after having suffered all of these aggressions and violence, were murdered. Some of them survived, others died, and they have had to learn how to live with dignity, with their broken dignity, and with all of the humiliations they had to suffer. Young women who were sold for just very little money and raped girls. Women who are war victims, after all of the things they have experienced, they still have enough strength to start up new projects, to demand their rights in order to go to the courts and to ask for social protection. They have stopped being silent and they have started to speak up and to talk about what happened to them between 1992 and 1995. With their own testimonials, they have brought many war criminals to court and to international trials. The role played by women nowadays, in spite of all of the things they have had to suffer and experience, they are still very proactive. We have women in our association and in other associations with whom we work who participate in a proactive way in the therapies that are given to other women who suffered different physical violence, and also the participation of women in some educational organizations. And socially, they are very active indeed. Our association helps all types of women, regardless of their nationality. They speak publicly about the rapes during the Bosnia and Herzegovina's war, and for the first time, and that was after the Bosnia war, rape is recognized as a war crime. In 2006, we actually presented a law according to which we had the right to get every month 612 Bosnian marks, convertible marks, and the right to legal protection and to health protection, the right to education, and also the right to access free legal advice. We have attained all of these rights. In terms of the reconciliation, this term offends us because we have never discussed against anybody. We have never fought against anybody. I mean, we have never thought that somebody should hate us because we belong to another religion. We do not talk about reconciliation. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, there is discrimination against women, especially in the Srpska Republic, where women only have 165 convertible marks in terms of help. The situation is the worst situation in Bosnia. We work in this situation, in this society, and it's not simple for us, but we are well organized in order to get our rights. We're organized in order to be able to access certain societal positions that are forbidden to women still in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They are only reserved for men. We, as women, we have been not only raped, but we have been also humiliated. In our own personal stories are very important to ourselves and for the whole Bosnia and Herzegovina. And it's a future warning for future generations so that nobody in the future suffers the evil we have had to suffer. Our organization many years ago has not been doing anything many years ago. as a state. And that's why we became associated as women. And that's why we presented our association to the government to ask for all of these rights. I have to say that silence is equal to evil. If we are silent, it looks or it sounds like nothing has happened to us. Thank you for this first round of presentations by our Bosnian colleagues, and we will now give the floor to our Colombian and Syrian colleagues. During the second round, you will have a chance to talk about, to elaborate on what you have been saying. Fine. As you can see, the technical details are hard to manage. So now we will give the floor to Helga and to Noor to end this first round of impressions and thoughts about the differentiated impacts between men and women in armed conflict situations.
Ja vas čujem, ne znam da... Ne znam.
Bueno.
Fine. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'd like to greet warmly our Bosnian colleagues, our Bosnian sisters. They are very courageous women. My name is Helga Flamtermesky. I'm Colombian. I am part of the NGO Female Diaspora. And in order to answer the question you have asked about the impacts, I'd like to say a few things that maybe could help us connect. Because, I mean, not being connected is like re-victimizing the women who have suffered this type of violence. First, this type of violence, specifically sexual violence in the framework of a war conflict, it happens not only in the framework of the armed conflict, but this is the type of violence that happens already before that, in the household, in the family space. And we see that there is an increasing connection between sexual violence within families or within the neighborhood, and we intertwine it, we link it up with the sexual violence in armed conflicts. This type of conflict, this type of sexual violence is part of the war for the people involved in the war. We also see that in wartime, women are taken as a war territory, as a war conquest, to show that men have won. It is true that through sexual violence, people want to intimidate, send messages, and generate fear. But in order to exist this violence, you need a physical impulse. Not only a message, but there should be some sexual desire in men. And this is so important because it is justified in some cases to think that, well, this person needed to do it because he was sending a message. No, there had to be a physical impulse that took him to the rape. I'm not going to tell you how a rape works, but that is needed. And that makes them even more responsible and guilty for what they have done. Because to send that message, the message, I mean, there was physical desire, physical lust to do it. There must be physical lust in a space of war conflict. So the vision they had about women was already a very low vision, because they had already regularized physical violence within their family environment and their social environment. So from the point of view of a soldier, well, it is only normal, it is only natural that they do so. Now, women have been talking about, for many, many years in Colombia, we've been talking about sexual violence in the framework of other spaces. And we have had many, many demonstrations and many, many research studies we have carried out. But it is the time to call men. What do they think? Why are men demonstrating and saying, I do not agree with what you're doing. I do not agree with what other men did. With their silence, other men who have not raped, maybe they're also accomplices of the rapes carried out during the war. So this should not only be a wait for women, it should also involve other men. It should also make other men be engaged, men who are part of the patriarchy. And finally, as an impact, I'm going to try to say something different to what our Bosnian sisters have said. In addition to physical raping, after a physical rape, women, their body starts getting certain signals as if it were a rape. When women try to explain what happened to them and they are not believed, they experience it as a second rape. When they ask them a number of requirements in victims' processes or peace processes, it's as if they were being raped again physically. The body always remembers. The body has a memory. And this is part of the reason why women have been silent, why they have kept silent, because with their testimonial, they may feel raped again. And that's why some of them have chosen silence. Fine. Well, thank you very much indeed. First of all, I'd like to apologize for my bad Spanish. I know that limits very much, but I need to express myself in public. Not to express myself, but to justify the voices of many million of women, Syrian women, who the war conflict in Syria is having a very specific and strong impact on them. In order to talk about that impact, I have to say that I see it as a transformation of the nature of the conflict in Syria. We have to remember that the conflict in Syria started as a revolution against the dictatorship within the framework of the Arab Spring. There was a lot of activism. And the first impact was the political decision to arrest people. And then that was, the peaceful demonstrations, which was not a conflict, it was a revolution, it became a conflict. And with this transformation, the warplanes came and the bombs started falling from the sky. And the bombardment of civil populations started. Most of the victims of this type of violence, the bombardment of civilian populations by the Syrian government had a specific impact on women because they were in hospitals, schools, and markets, which were the targets of these bombs. Then the conflict became even more complicated, and even the impact it had on women became even more complicated. We talk not only about political arrests and tortures. We talk not only about civilian victims, people injured during the bombings, but also missing people, victims of forced disappearances, and also other terrible effects. And that impact, as I've said, was transformed. And in order to understand the transformation of the conflict, when I refer to Syria, I think of a map of Syria with many colors, because each color represents an area of military control. Syria is a divided country, divided up and occupied in many places. A large part is occupied by the Syrian government and its Russian and Iranian allies and militias. Other parts are controlled by armed groups, and unfortunately, that's in the hands of Al-Qaeda. And then in the northern area, in some parts of the north of Syria, it is under the control of Turkey. It is the Turkish government who is also giving support to the occupation of a part of the territory. And the other part of the north of Syria is occupied by Kurd forces. And we have another part of Syria where there is a camp of displaced people, and this area is under the military control of the United States and the international coalition that fought and eliminated the Islamic State terrorist group. So in all of these areas of military control, there are different layers, layer over layer of repression of the civilian population, but especially of women. So, just to give you an idea, just to give you an overview of the victims, of the women who are victims, it has been estimated, an interesting piece of data, it has been estimated that in 2013, the United Nations, which normally in armed conflicts, it documents the violations of human rights, the number of casualties, etc. In 2013, it stopped documenting these figures because it said it had no access to the data. And this was a strategy by the Syrians to do that. So it was an impossible mission. And in Syria nowadays, it has been calculated that about 300,000 women have died as victims of bombings by all of the parties involved in the conflict, but 93% of them in the hands by the Syrian government itself. Then we have 9,000 women are missing, also by all of the parties involved in the conflict, but especially by the Syrian government. And there are 8,156 women out of the 9,668 women. 8,156 women are missing or have been arrested by the Syrian government. So these are figures, but behind each number, behind each figure, there is a personal story. Stories very similar to the ones we have seen here. Very similar to what we've seen in the photo exhibition or the stories told by Melissa, etc. But if we want to look at the impact from another perspective, we also have to speak in socioeconomic terms, the forced migration of Syrian people who are forced to living in refugee camps for displaced people in neighboring countries or forced migration. In Syria, the Syrian population used to be 21 million before the conflict. And nowadays, according to the United Nations, we have 3 million people who are refugees or who are internal displaced people. 6 million are refugees. They have not documented the number of people who have a refugee status or who are exiled or who are the victims of physical violence. And so 6 million people are displaced internally. And out of these people, most of them are women who live in camps. I don't know if you have seen some of the pictures that come from Moira, from the refugee camps in the island of Lesbos in Moira. I don't know whether you have seen the pictures recently under the rain. Well, these internal camps in Syria are very similar to Moira. They have no health services, and the conditions under which women are forced to live are just horrendous. They do not have basic hygiene services. They have no basic hygiene possibilities. And this is the daily reality that hurts the most, in my opinion. I could speak a lot, but let me share with you another small detail I'd like to highlight. The loss of lives also implies a change of roles in Syrian families. And the traditional role played by women in Syrian families was the role of a caregiver. With the loss of men, with the men who died in the conflict, 1 million men, a lot of women all of a sudden have seen how their life changed 180 degrees. They went from being caregivers to the breadwinner, people who, they are forced to look for a paid job, and at the same time they have to take care of young children and the elderly. And this change can be seen from a positive point of view or from a negative point of view, depending on the people, the context, and the conditions. But there are many, many things that could be discussed, and I cannot cover them all in the 5 minutes that have been allotted to me. Well, my goodness, we would love to devote much more time to your thoughts. Some housekeeping issues. For people who think, for you to think about potential questions. Given that people from the audience cannot share the roving mic because of the pandemic, please write down your questions and then pass them on. And there will be a hostess that will collect your written questions at the end of the second round of questions. And, well, our colleagues here had been told that we would have 2 rounds of questions, but given that time flies, we will merge a number of questions. So the next point to be discussed is which have been the contributions made by women in the different contexts. This is also something that Maria wants to analyze in greater depth. What is your role currently, and what are the challenges or opportunities you see for the future? Or which spaces do you believe are necessary in these contexts for the future? So, not only the present contributions, but also with a gaze towards the future in order to look for the truth, justice, and peace in this context. Maybe we could start with our colleagues from Bosnia, or should we start with our colleagues who are physically here with us in the room? If you prefer, you can start here because I do not see our Bosnian colleagues. Maria, please, could you confirm? Have our Bosnian colleagues heard me? Anya and Marisa, have you heard me? Meliha and Anya, have you understood my question? Yes. Meliha, we have to see if she hears us, and Anya hears us. Anya does hear us, yes.
Da. Pa dobro, evo što se tiče uloge žena trenutno u procesima izgradnje.
Well, with regards to the participation of women in the construction of Bosnian society, I have to highlight that women in Bosnia and Herzegovina are the ones who have first come out to the street, inviting everybody to peace. Since the end of the war, women from Bosnia and Herzegovina have created many organizations and associations that have as a goal the construction of peace. And to them, it has been an internal need, because they are the ones who have suffered the war in the worst terms firsthand. And they have concluded that they have to be united in order to prevent this violence in the future. They are the first ones who have recognized the importance of preventing conflicts. Now, with regards to the role played by women, and regarding the current situation, there is a the largest feminist organization in Bosnia of feminist women. And that organization has decided to visit other local units, other municipalities, where they have talked to the women from these towns and municipalities, asking them what the new Bosnia has given them after the war. And the results we have obtained are rather interesting, because we have seen that in these organizations and associations have not got any right. Their situation has not improved at all. And they still live in a dark night. And my declaration, I mean, my mother, women who have suffered the most during the war, who have been raped, are the ones who have broken their silence, and they have come out to the world to express everything they have suffered during the war in front of everybody, in front of the government. And that implies an incredible courage, because to face them and to express all of the things that have happened to them implies the need for a lot of courage. Unfortunately, the construction of peace and the construction of a new society is very hard in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because politicians are still separating people according to nationalities and ethnic groups. There is a lot of corruption and a lot of uneasiness about this. Now, with regards to the importance of female activism and its contributions in the future, I have to say that we, as children of the war, I mean, to come out to the street, thanks to these women who have suffered so much, like my mother, I mean, thanks to them, we have been following suit. We have a role model to follow, and we have realized that silence is not a solution. And if we break up the silence, what we will be doing is contributing to the construction of the peace. We try to meet with the children who are the result of the outcome of rapes and sexual violence and conflict. We work with a lot of peace organizations and with children whose parents have participated in humanitarian organizations. All of our women, all of our mothers, until we have started speaking, our mothers, in spite of suffering every terror, have said that there are no bad nationalities. There are bad individuals. And my mother, in spite of suffering everything she has suffered, she has always been an advocate for justice. And she has always defended that if we want to have a better Bosnia and Herzegovina, we should be ready to have a dialogue. We should be able to have communication. We have little dialogue. We speak little to each other. But the way women organize themselves in their own associations, what Meliha does in our association is our contribution to the building of peace. We carry out the work that the government should be carrying out and that it doesn't do. All of the things I do and all of the things I fight for I fight for the equality of rights of women, both women who have both suffered on the Serbian side or on the Bosnian side. And I have to say that the biggest problem in Bosnia and Herzegovina is the rape. It's an ethnic problem. It is the biggest trauma that a human being can feel, regardless of whether they are Serb, Bosnian, or Croatian. Rapes leaves an imprint on women, regardless of their nationality. This is what our Bosnian women are disseminating. They say that they are equal to other women, and all together we have to build up peace and coexistence. It's very hard, whilst you're telling us about these things, to give you enough time, the time you need to have this common voice of experience. But we have, unfortunately, to follow the agenda. Meliha, you have now 5 or 6 minutes to share your vision with us. Well, I'll try to express myself in 5 or 6 minutes. And I'm going to actually add to what Ajna has said already. What I said beforehand, I mean, to us, reconciliation, the term reconciliation is a term that to me is an insult, is an offense. We have not actually fought with anybody. We have not wanted to fight anybody. We have been the victims of ethnic cleansing, and rape has been used as a powerful weapon during the war. Women have been systematically raped for that ethnic cleansing. And my experience with the work with women, and I myself, through the trials, I mean, women slowly, bit by bit, they are getting their own spiritual peace. Talking about this, they provide testimonials about the crime that has been committed, and they somehow set the record straight. What hurts the most is negationism. I mean, the denial of what has happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the denial through confirmed court rulings. I mean, the peace that we all pursue, we as women, we have always said that we never fought anybody. We do not need to reconcile. We are just interested in fighting for our own rights. Some of rights which we have already attained. We still have a lot of rights pending. Something that the Bosnia and Herzegovina government does not give us. It doesn't listen to us. A lot of women die. A lot of women are missing. I mean, there is no record of this type of crimes. Reconciliation, I mean, to me, that term means nothing at all. I do not need to say anything else. Yes, let me add something, please. The denial is the worst crime we're suffering currently in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Meliha is absolutely right. She has the right to say that denial is the worst crime. To speak about things and to shed light on these crimes is a guarantee that these will not happen again. And the women who have suffered from this injustice and this violence are the ones who need to defend themselves. And their names have to be cleaned in this patriarchal society. We need an urgent law that foresees exemplary punishment to any person denying what happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the war. Nobody can deny the wounds that my mother has and that I personally have in my own skin. Nobody can deny that. People living in Spain should always remember Meliha's words. Denial is not acceptable. Nobody can deny what we have suffered. Fine, so now let's give the floor to the people present here. If you have any questions between each other, if you want to share questions, please take advantage of the possibility of the fact that you share a panel. Helga.
Hola. Bueno. A nivel de
Hello. In terms of transformations, to sum up, because I can proudly say that in Colombia, women, for more than 50 years, we have had such a long conflict. Women have always had an incredible capacity to transform themselves constantly, to transform negative circumstances in order to have a more livable life, always thinking about the community, thinking about the family, thinking about the whole nation. It's incredible what women have done. The most valuable part has also been that women in Colombia have introduced in the peace agreement the victims, women especially. And this has allowed all of these policies to be developed around the victims and to have a specific gender perspective, so to speak. And I say so to speak because in Colombia, the term gender does not mean anything because it is used for everything and for nothing. We should be talking about the rights of women, full stop. It is also important to say that silence has been broken. Women have started speaking up. Women have spoken in different spaces. They have talked in victims' units. They have talked in different women associations like the Peaceful Pathway. They have given testimonials. They have spoken up in the Commission for the Truth. And their stories are always not only what happened to them and what they had to face, and how they faced it, there is a whole lesson involved for the construction of peace. Because peace, we Colombian people can say so now. We have had the signature, we have had a peace agreement, but we still have a very high level of violence. I can say that women have been peace builders in all of our actions. Because faced with the dramatic situation of a woman who's a victim, or who was a victim of a violent fact, due to the conflict or to whatever, there was always somebody ready to help her. There were always other women ready to help her. And that person could raise up and get organized. And a lot of women who did not know who were social organizations ended up helping out. And a lot of women who did not share organizational movements, notwithstanding that, they still help and support the construction of peace. And the main lesson that we have learned is that we women have learned to adapt constantly to every circumstance, trying to transform all of the things that happen to us. Well, I also feel very proud because Syrian women have also been on the front line. They have always been responding and first facing the shock and responding to the effects of the shock, caring for their daily needs and for peace construction. But in the Syrian case, to talk about peace construction is still too early. We are still trying to see, to learn how to make our claims for justice. But at the same time, given that we're still in the midst of the conflict, we're in the very middle of the conflict has not yet ended in Syria. Rapes and the violations of human rights continue on a daily basis. Persecutions, arrests, all of these conflicts continue day by day. So the conflict hasn't stopped yet. It is still very active. And in the very middle of this conflict, women have been pioneers, as I've said. Well, citizens like myself, I was a translator in my country. I became an activist. Yesterday, I read about a teacher who lives in the north of Syria. She's 35, and now she is the director of the Al-Hun prison, which is the most dangerous prison in the world, because that's where her family is, and also members of Islamic State. So common citizens, normal people who had nothing to do with the world of activism, they became activists. And then we have journalists as well, filmmakers, film directors. The conflict brought about a change of role, of the role played by women, not only in the family, but also in society, which is negative, but at the same time is positive because it's empowering, in the sense that we women were learning a lot from this experience. We're learning how to document, for example, a violation of human rights, how to create a document with the right data, with photographs, and with everything. We're learning how to respond. For example, when a building falls down, when a building crumbles because of a bomb, we're learning how to document that too. And also, we are learning how to claim for justice. And I'd like to highlight some important movements that have seen the light thanks to Families for Freedom, which you have mentioned, Pamela. That's a movement that was co-founded by 3 women, spouses, wives, mothers, or daughters of missing people. How, like the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina do. They demand to know where their loved ones are from every part of the conflict. And then another association whose executive chairwoman is a woman, Mahan Halaf. She lost her son. Her son was tortured and executed. He was killed by the tortures. And his body has not been yet given to her. So Mariam Maslachov, together with 2 other women, they didn't know where their loved ones are until people who have been tortured and murdered. And they turned all of this into what's called the dossiers of the Caesar's photographs. Does anybody know about this? Has anybody have heard about it? Well, the Kaiser's dossier, the Kaiser's file, is one of the proof with the greatest weight from a scientific point of view internationally after the Nuremberg trials, that there is a systematic use of torture in arrest centers in Syria. Kaiser is the pen name of a man who worked as a photographer for 3 years in these centers. His job was to make photographs of the murdered people. In 2012, he fled from there, and he with him all of the files. And that was brought to the Hague, and now it is being used as a court case for justice. And thanks to the international law, a case was started together with an official that used to work for the Syrian government. And what's most interesting is that 2 months ago, some victims, some women who have been incredibly courageous because they have broken up the silence, to also talk about the systematic use of rape and sexual violence in arrest centers of the Syrian government. And they presented their case. And, well, I do not know exactly the legal terms, but it's very interesting because they say that in Syria, you have to look at sexual violence and gender violence because some men, it has to be said, some men have been the victims of sexual violence in these arrest centers in Syria. So this is another action undertaken to make this sexual violence visible in the Syrian conflict, for it to be considered as a war crime and as a violation of the human right. And then there is an association of women who have launched a campaign called Syrian Women for Justice. And with this campaign, what they want to do is to increase the opportunities to access the justice system legally, the survivors of sexual violence. Because as earlier Ajna has explained, the impact that these type of crimes have on people is terrible. So there are many, many things that are being done by women. Not only they're doing them, but they're also leading the way towards justice and one day the reconstruction of peace. I'd like to also highlight some initiative actions in which activist women organizations carry out common activities in order to try to reestablish some coexistence in the northeastern part of Syria, where the situation is extremely complex due to the Turkish occupation. So the situation is incredibly complex, I know it. But the most important role played by women nowadays is basically to protect our stories and to fight for it. Because what Meliha and Ajna have said is very important. We know that denying what is happening is the worst. I mean, the worst that can happen is that people say, no, you're wrong, that didn't happen. This is happening in our country, and we have to protect our stories. The Syrian government is even not giving us a right to protect our own stories. And they are creating their own story that denies our story. I'll stop here. Well, I don't know if there are any questions. Maria, do you have any questions? Has anybody from the audience, would anybody from the audience like to ask anything or ask our panel members any questions? Maria, how are we doing time-wise? Fine. Well, maybe we could take advantage of a new connection with Bosnia now. We're here to listen to them, to listen to Ajna, Meliha, Helga, and Noor. Would any of you like to make a final statement? Ajna, Meliha, have you been able to follow well what Noor and Helga have said? I have made a number of notes because there are some common themes. Would you like to react or give us some feedback to what you have heard so far? Ajna or Meliha? Ajna, you have the floor. Yes. To end, I'd like to add that it is very important to understand that this struggle against sexual violence against women cannot be won if we do not act all together. Fortunately, there are many NGOs who want to help us out, but I believe that only women and all of us working in this field together, we will be able to attain something if we work together. Meliha can help me if she wishes, but all of the people who work together to fight sexual violence or violence in general against women in wartime, before taking any action, they must talk to these people who have suffered from this sexual violence. And I know firsthand the story of my mother. I know how much my mother has suffered. And that's why every time they talk about women who have survived these rapes and sexual violence, it is very important that they explain how they approach this. It's very important to talk to them directly. With regards to myself, I'd like to highlight the importance of the fact that all children who are born as a result of a rape, they should not be referred to as the children of hatred or the children of violence. We want to live in peace. And through our struggle, and we are not the heirs of the war criminals. We're not the heirs of war criminals. And for us, we just want to live in peace. And in order to build up peace, we all have to find first our own internal peace in order to be able to build up the external peace. And as Meliha has said, to all of the victims of rape, they should have legal tools to fight against this, because the justice system actually should listen to their claims. It is them who have suffered through their bodies these crimes. So the denial of sexual violence crimes against women in Bosnia is the worst crime. And I hope that we will be able to come to the point of recognizing the victims and that this serves as a lesson for future generations. Thank you. Meliha, would you like to say something? Well, my brother and my father were murdered. My mother and I survived. I still suffer, and I fight for women who are victims of war. I give them all of my support. But what the take-home message, the message I'd like to give to all women who have suffered from sexual violence is that they do not remain silent. They should speak up. They are not the ones who should feel guilty or embarrassed by these crimes. The ones who perpetrated it, the perpetrators are the ones who are guilty and should feel ashamed. And the international community has not played its role. during the war. If the international community had acted beforehand, none of the things that have happened would have happened. There would have not been so many murders and so many missing people. We may expect some help from the international community. Well, maybe we cannot, but what we can do is to force our institutions and to force our own governments to work and to take care of this population. We cannot expect anything from the others or from the rest or from the international community. My message to all women is that they speak up, that they fight for their own rights in their own countries. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you as far as I've been able to express my experiences and my work with the victims of sexual violence. And I thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, or for inviting me and for listening to me. Thank you, and all the best for you all. Thank you, Ajna, and thank you, Meliha. I'd like to invite Helga and Noor, if they wanted to share some final comments or final thoughts with us, linking up with the words that Ajna and Meliha have given us. Well, thank you very much indeed once again. I'd like to confirm with Ajna and Meliha that they are not isolated, they are not on their own, they are not alone. We are united by so many struggles and common goals. And the pandemic has affected us all, but borders have been erased, paradoxically, and here we are, all together via Zoom, through the virtual space. And in this way, we can turn our fight struggles into global struggles. So, Bosnian sisters, you can count with us here in Barcelona, with the Colombian diaspora, and I'm sure that with Noor, with yourself too. Isn't it? Yes, indeed. Thank you for listening to us. Thank you for giving us this space. This is what we need nowadays. We truly need it. Our message needs to be repeated over and over again. Since the war in Syria started, well, the revolution and then the conflict, when I was coming here, I was really curious to find out about the civil war in Spain. And I saw many documentary films about the Spanish Civil War and the genocide in Srebrenica and the conflict in Bosnia and other conflicts. And it's always the same story. There are always photographs and a slogan, which is never, ever again, never, ever again. Never again is the slogan. Well, never again, and yet it's always the same story that's repeated. Whilst watching the photography exhibition, I was really astounded by the fabrics. This is what I found in Aleppo, in Syria, where, the civilians would actually use that to escape from the snipers. And also, Ajna and Meliha have talked about Ajna has talked about how much her mother has suffered, and Meliha also about her association of women victims of war. And it's also what Helga does. There is a common thread, there is a common front, and the question is always why? How can we change that? Not only in Syria, but throughout the world. How can we end this horror? And that's my question. And I'd like you not to forget the Syrian conflict. I know it's a very complex conflict, and there are many fake news, and there is a lot of disinformation about it. But there is a lot of resistance as well, and we need that we need not to be forgotten in order to reach justice one day. If there are no questions from the audience, well, the only thing I have left to do is to thank the 4 great women who have been with us here today. I'd like to mention some very interesting ideas that have come up during the panel discussion. The idea of the need to keep on working for justice and the violence against women, especially sexual violence, needs to be understood in this context, as Helga has just reminded us. This is part of a continuum of violence that starts in the private realm, in the family, within the family, and it goes all the way to a war conflict. I mean, women who have to undergo this terrible situation from one end to the other of the continuum. Then also another interesting idea is the need to break up the silence, the need to protect the story, to protect the narrative, and to fight against denial. And this is the first step to fight against impunity. Another interesting idea, and I used Ajna's words, she says that given the experience that women have had in Bosnia, they are very much aware of the importance of preventing future conflicts. And this is something they insist on very much. Many women organizations around the world insist on this. The main promoters of the agenda of gender and peace have moved this, and they made this first approach in the United Nations because they wanted it to be a tool for prevention of conflicts, not for warfare to be carried out with a gender perspective, no, but to prevent conflict. This is an idea that I believe is a very, very good idea that Ajna has given us. And the incredible capacity that these women have to overcome their pain and to act proactively to prevent this from ever happening again. And finally, what has been said about the need to have a dialogue and to share common experiences and to put together all of these women around the world who are fighting for the common cause of justice. And Lourdes has talked to us about the lessons learned about how to fight against sexual violence and how to share the common experiences from different contexts. And this shows evidently that in spite of all of the differences between the case of Colombia, Bosnia and Syria, who are in very different phases, it is still possible to learn lessons that are applicable to all of us as to how to manage our reality and how to look for the transformation of these conflict dynamics. I'd like to thank all of the people who have come here physically today. I have been the one moderating this panel discussion, and I do not know whether anybody from the ICIP would like to do an official closure. If not, I'll do it myself. I'd like to thank all of the people who have attended, and thank you very much indeed to all of you.